The rain drizzled lightly against the windowpane as Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It had been a long day, but he wasn't tired. He was deep in thought, replaying the events that had led him here. Success had come his way, but at what cost? Just a few years ago, Daniel had been like everyone else. Ambitious, hungry, eager to prove himself. He had worked tirelessly, putting in long hours, sacrificing sleep, and skipping social gatherings just to make sure his dreams didn't remain dreams. And when success finally knocked on his door, he embraced it with open arms. His bank account grew, his lifestyle changed, and soon, people began to take notice. At first, he remained humble. He remembered where he came from, the struggles, the sacrifices. But as time passed, he started enjoying the attention. He found himself posting about every achievement on social media, making sure people saw the new car, the expensive watch, the 5-star vacations. It wasn't enough to succeed. He needed people to see that he had succeeded. His old friends began to distance themselves. They no longer saw the same Daniel they had once known. The conversations became shallow. Interactions became transactional. But he didn't mind. After all, wasn't this what success looked like? Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, at a high-profile business event, Daniel stood among influential people, boasting about his latest venture. He spoke with confidence, exaggerating his achievements just enough to make himself look superior. He could feel the admiration in the room, or so he thought. An older man, someone who had been in the industry for decades, listened quietly. When Daniel finished speaking, the man simply smiled and said, "True success doesn't need an audience." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He forced a laugh, brushing it off, but something inside him shifted. As the night went on, he began to notice something. Those who truly held power, those who had built empires, weren't the ones showing off. They weren't flashing their wealth or seeking validation. They carried themselves with quiet confidence, letting their actions speak louder than words. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He realized he had been so focused on proving his success to others that he had forgotten the true purpose of his journey. But was it too late to change? As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, he knew he had a choice to make: continue down the same path or redefine what success really meant. And that's when everything began to shift. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone screen. The blue glow illuminated his face as he scrolled through his own social media feed. Post after post, picture after picture, expensive dinners, luxury trips, motivational captions about hard work and success. It all looked impressive, but for the first time, he saw it differently. It felt empty. He put his phone down and ran a hand through his hair. The words from the older man at the event echoed in his mind. True success doesn't need an audience. Why had that simple sentence unsettled him so much? He had always believed success was something to be displayed, something to be admired. Wasn't that the whole point of working hard? His thoughts drifted back to when he had first started. The late nights spent learning, the risks he had taken, the moments of doubt when he wasn't sure if he would ever make it. Back then, success wasn't about validation. It was about proving to himself that he could do it. Somewhere along the way that changed. The next morning, Daniel walked into his office feeling different. His team greeted him as usual, but he noticed something he hadn't before. Some of them seemed hesitant, careful with their words. Were they intimidated by him? He had never thought about it before. He had always assumed his success was inspiring them, pushing them to work harder. But now, he wasn't so sure. As he settled into his desk, his assistant, Megan, walked in with a folder. "Morning, Daniel. Just a reminder, you have a meeting at 2 with the investors." He nodded, distracted. "Thanks, Megan." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "By the way, I saw your post last night. The one about the car." Daniel glanced up. "Yeah." She offered a polite smile. "It's a nice car. Then, after a pause, she added, "You've come a long way." Something about the way she said it made Daniel uneasy. It wasn't admiration. It felt more like observation. He wanted to ask what she really meant, but before he could, she left the room. The day went on, but the feeling stayed with him. At lunch, he found himself sitting alone in his office, staring out the window. He used to spend breaks with his team, chatting, exchanging ideas. When had that stopped? His phone buzzed. A message from an old friend, Alex. "Haven't seen you in a while. You still the same guy?" Daniel frowned. He typed out a quick reply. "Of course. Just been busy." Alex's response came almost immediately. "Busy or too busy for the people who knew you before all this?" Daniel let out a slow breath. Why did it suddenly feel like everyone was seeing something he hadn't? Later that evening, he found himself driving without a destination. He wasn't in the mood to go home, and the city streets felt oddly comforting. As he passed by an old cafe he used to visit, he impulsively pulled over. The place hadn't changed much. Dim lighting, quiet atmosphere, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, lost in thought. A few minutes later, a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't Daniel Carter." He looked up. It was Mark, an old colleague from his early days. Back then, they had worked side by side, struggling to make a name for themselves. But while Daniel had climbed higher, Mark had chosen a different path. One without the flashy success, but steady nonetheless. Daniel smiled. "Mark. It's been a while." Mark took a seat across from him. "Yeah, it has. I see you everywhere these days. Can't scroll through social media without seeing your name." Daniel chuckled, but it felt forced. "Just staying active." Mark studied him for a moment. "You happy?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Mark shrugged. "I don't know. Just seems like you've got everything, but you look like a guy who's trying to convince himself he's enjoying it." Daniel frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark leaned back. "Look, I'm not saying success is bad. You've worked for it. You deserve it. But I remember the guy who was obsessed with the work itself, not just what it could buy him." Daniel was silent. Mark continued. "There's a difference between being successful and needing people to know you're successful. One is about growth. The other? It's just noise." Daniel let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "You sound like this guy I met at an event yesterday." Mark grinned. "Smart guy then." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The background noise of the cafe, the distant hum of conversation, the sound of coffee cups clinking, it all felt strangely grounding. For the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't in a rush. He wasn't checking his phone or thinking about his next big move. He was just there, in the moment. But the question remained, was he ready to change? Or had he gone too far to turn back? Daniel drove home in silence, his mind heavy with thoughts. The conversation with Mark had stirred something deep inside him, something uncomfortable yet impossible to ignore. He had spent years building a version of success that he thought was right. One filled with recognition, admiration, and proof of his achievements. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong thing all along. The next morning, he woke up early and, out of habit, reached for his phone. His notifications were filled with likes and comments on his latest post. People were praising his lifestyle, asking about his car, congratulating him on his success. A week ago, this would have made him feel invincible. Today it felt hollow. As he got dressed, he decided to take a different route to work. Instead of his usual high-rise office, he stopped by a quiet park he hadn't visited in years. He sat on a bench, watching as people walked by. An old man feeding birds, a young woman jogging, a father playing with his son. No one here cared about wealth, status, or social media followers. They were simply living. A voice broke his thoughts. "Mind if I sit?" Daniel looked up to see a man in his 60s, dressed in a simple but well-tailored suit. His face was calm, his posture relaxed. Daniel nodded, and the man took a seat beside him. "You look like someone with a lot on his mind," the man said, his voice steady but kind. Daniel hesitated before responding. "Just thinking about what really matters." The man chuckled. "That's a rare thing these days. Most people are too busy trying to prove something to stop and ask themselves that question." Daniel turned to him, curious. "Do you think success loses its meaning when you spend too much time showing it off?" The man smiled. "That depends. Are you building something for yourself, or are you building it for the world to see?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I used to think success was about being seen, about making sure people knew I had made it. But now, I'm not so sure. It feels like, the more I show, the emptier it gets." The man nodded. "That's because true success isn't loud. It doesn't need validation. It just is." Daniel let those words sink in. He had spent years chasing recognition, but for what? To impress people he barely knew? To prove something to those who never really mattered? His phone buzzed, pulling him back to reality. It was Megan, his assistant. "You need to get to the office. There's a situation." Daniel quickly stood up, his mind shifting back to work. He turned to thank the man, but he was already walking away, blending into the city like a whisper. By the time Daniel reached his office, the tension in the air was thick. His team was gathered in the conference room, their faces uneasy. Megan handed him a tablet. "It's about the investors. They're backing out." His stomach dropped. "What? Why?" Megan hesitated. "They think you're too focused on image, not enough on the business itself." Daniel clenched his jaw. "That's ridiculous. We've been performing well. They don't see it that way. They think you've lost sight of the company's vision." The words stung more than he expected. He had built this business from the ground up, yet now, it felt like his own success was being used against him. He looked around the room, realizing that no one was arguing against what was being said. His team, his own employees, were avoiding eye contact. Did they think the same thing? Megan spoke again, her voice softer. "Daniel, maybe they're not completely wrong." His head snapped toward her. "What's that supposed to mean?" She hesitated before replying. "Lately, it feels like this company is more about you than the work. The social media posts, the interviews, the luxury lifestyle. It's like the business is just part of the show." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. "I built this company." "I know," Megan said. "And that's exactly why people follow you. But they're starting to wonder if you're still leading, or just performing." The room was silent. Daniel looked at his team, talented people who had been with him through the struggles, who had believed in his vision. Had he let them down? His fingers curled around the edge of the table. "We can fix this. I'll set up a meeting with the investors. We'll remind them why they believed in us in the first place." Megan nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't sure if the damage could be undone. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The lights flickered in the distance, each one representing a story, a dream, a life. 4 years he had thought he had won. But now, he wasn't sure if he had been playing the right game. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the walls. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos inside his mind. His company, his pride, his creation, was slipping away, and for the first time he had to face the possibility that it was his fault. The investors were pulling out, his employees had lost faith, and the image he had worked so hard to build was starting to crack. His phone buzzed. Another notification. Another message. Another reminder that people were still watching, waiting for him to prove something. But what was left to prove? He had spent so much time crafting a picture of success that he hadn't noticed when it had become just that, a picture. Megan knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. Daniel, the investors agreed to meet. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. He nodded but didn't respond right away. She hesitated, then spoke again, her voice careful. I know this isn't easy, but this might be your chance to turn things around. Daniel looked up at her. And what if I can't? She sighed, leaning against the desk. Then maybe it's time to figure out what really matters to you. Her words lingered long after she left. He wasn't sure if he was more afraid of losing his company or realizing that, deep down, he had already lost himself. That night, he barely slept. His mind kept circling back to everything. The long nights he spent building this business, the sacrifices he made, the friends he lost along the way. He had always thought the struggle was worth it, but now he wasn't sure if he had been climbing a mountain only to realize there was nothing at the top. By the time morning arrived, Daniel felt like he was running on autopilot. He put on his best suit, straightened his tie, and stepped into the boardroom with a confidence he had perfected over the years. But as he looked at the faces of the investors, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: doubt. Not in the company. In him. One of the senior investors, Mr. Reynolds, folded his hands on the table. Daniel, let's be honest. You've built something impressive, but lately, we've been questioning where your focus really is. Daniel forced a smile. My focus has always been on growing this company. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Has it? Because from what we see, your priority seems to be your personal brand, not the business itself. We need to know, are you leading this company, or just marketing yourself? The question stung because it was the same one he had been asking himself. He glanced at Megan, who was watching him carefully, as if silently urging him to be honest. Daniel took a deep breath. I won't deny that I've been caught up in the image of success. But this company isn't just a brand to me, it's everything I've worked for. Another investor, Ms. Patel, leaned forward. Then show us that. Because right now, we're not convinced. The weight of their words pressed down on him, but before he could respond, his phone vibrated on the table. Instinctively, he glanced at the screen. A news alert. His name was in the headlines. Daniel Carter's image of success. Is it all smoke and mirrors? His stomach dropped. Reynolds sighed, pushing the phone away. This is exactly what we mean. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent years controlling the narrative, making sure the world saw what he wanted them to see. But now, the story was being written without him. The meeting continued, but Daniel barely heard the rest. His carefully crafted world was unraveling, and for the first time, he didn't know if he could stop it. The meeting ended, but Daniel felt like he was still sitting at that table, still trapped in the weight of those words. The investors had made one thing clear: they weren't going to wait forever. Either he proved that his focus was on the company, or they were walking away for good. He stepped out of the boardroom, his mind racing. Megan was waiting for him in the hallway, arms crossed. She didn't say anything at first, just studied him with an expression that made his stomach tighten. They're right, she finally said. Daniel let out a sharp breath. I know. She tilted her head slightly, as if waiting to see if he'd argue, if he'd push back like he always did. But he didn't. He couldn't. Before she could respond, his phone rang. He almost ignored it, he had enough to deal with, but when he saw the name on the screen, his chest tightened. Alex. He answered, walking toward his office. Hey. Daniel, you need to see this. Alex's voice was tense. Daniel frowned. See what? There was a pause, then the sound of typing. A few seconds later, a link popped up in his messages. Daniel clicked it, and as soon as the article loaded, his blood ran cold. Inside Daniel Carter's rise to fame. Is his success just a carefully crafted illusion? His name was everywhere. The article dissected everything. His posts, his interviews, his image. But it wasn't just speculation. There were sources. Anonymous employees. people who claimed to have worked with him. The accusations weren't illegal, but they were damaging. It painted him as someone obsessed with appearances, someone who built a brand more than a business. And then, at the very bottom, there was a leaked screenshot. An internal message from one of his own employees. Daniel's hands clenched into fists as he read the words. He cares more about looking successful than actually running the company. If things go south, he'll protect his image before he protects us. His pulse pounded. Someone inside his company had fed this to the media. Someone he trusted. Megan read over his shoulder, her face pale. Daniel, this is bad. He tossed his phone onto his desk. No kidding. She exhaled. We need to get ahead of this. Issue a statement. No, his voice was sharp. He wasn't going to play damage control like this was some PR mistake. This was deeper than that. Someone wanted him to fall. A thought hit him suddenly, something that made his stomach twist. Who do you think did this? Megan hesitated. You really want to go down that road? He looked at her. I don't have a choice. Her expression hardened, but she nodded. Then we start with the people closest to you. Daniel's mind was already racing. There weren't many who had direct access to the kind of information leaked. His leadership team. A few senior employees. People who had been with him for years. He felt a strange mix of anger and unease. For years, he had believed success was about standing at the top. But what if, in the process, he had made enemies he didn't even see coming? Daniel sat in his office, staring at the city skyline, his mind racing. Someone had betrayed him. Someone close. The realization stung more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years building a company, creating an image of success, and now it was all crumbling because someone wanted to bring him down. But who? And why? Megan paced beside him, arms crossed. We need to narrow this down. The information leaked wasn't public. It had to come from someone high up. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. That's what scares me. It means it's someone I trusted. His phone buzzed. Another message from Alex. I checked the article again. The language in the leaked messages feels familiar. Like someone who's been frustrated for a long time. Daniel's chest tightened. Frustrated. That meant it wasn't just business. It was personal. His mind sifted through conversations, interactions, small moments he might have overlooked. Then it hit him. Megan, he said slowly, his voice calm but tense. Who's been the most vocal about my priorities lately? She hesitated, then her eyes widened. You don't think? I need to talk to him. Minutes later, Daniel walked into a smaller office down the hall. Mark, his longtime operations manager, looked up from his desk, his face unreadable. You got a minute? Daniel asked, shutting the door behind him. Mark leaned back in his chair. What's going on? Daniel studied him for a moment. He had known Mark since the early days, back when the company was just a handful of people working out of a tiny office. He had been one of Daniel's most trusted employees, someone who always challenged him, always pushed for what was right. That's why it made sense. The article, Daniel said carefully. Someone leaked those messages. Mark didn't flinch. Yeah, I saw. Daniel took a slow breath. Was it you? Silence. Mark held his gaze, and for the first time, Daniel saw it. Resentment, disappointment, something deeper than just frustration. Mark sighed. I didn't want it to come to this. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then why? Mark leaned forward. Because you stopped caring about the company, Daniel. At least, not in the way you used to. You built something great, but somewhere along the way, it became more about you. The luxury, the attention, the image. The people who actually work here. We saw it happening. And when we tried to tell you, you didn't listen. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. So you went to the media? Mark shook his head. No. I didn't go to them. But I didn't stop it, either. Someone else leaked it, and I knew it would force you to see what you've been ignoring. Daniel exhaled, the weight of the truth settling in. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about trust. Trust he had broken without even realizing it. The realization cut deeper than anger. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a response. Mark stood up. You wanted to know who did this. Now you do. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? Daniel had no idea. But for the first time, he knew that pretending wasn't an option anymore. Daniel stood there, the weight of Mark's words pressing down on him. He had spent years crafting his image, chasing success, believing that visibility meant power. But now, stripped of all that, he saw something he had been blind to for too long. The people who had been there from the beginning, the ones who had built this company with him. And he had let them down. He let out a slow breath, trying to find the right words. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his voice quieter than he expected. Mark studied him for a long moment. Then start by listening. The words stayed with him long after Mark left. Daniel sat in his office, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how others saw him. He was thinking about what he had become. The next morning, he walked into the office differently. No expensive suit, no carefully crafted persona, just himself. He gathered his leadership team, the ones who had worked beside him for years, and he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He listened. At first, the room was tense. No one knew what to expect. But then Megan spoke. You lost our trust, Daniel, she said, not unkindly. Not because you failed, but because you stopped being honest, with us and with yourself. Others chimed in, sharing frustrations, concerns, things they had held back for too long. Daniel didn't interrupt. He took in every word. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. The tension was still there, but so was something else, a possibility, a chance to rebuild. Over the next few weeks, Daniel made changes. Not just for appearances, not for the media, but for the company. He stepped back from the spotlight and focused on what really mattered. His team, his vision, the purpose that had once fueled him. The headlines faded. The investors who had been on the fence saw the shift and decided to stay. But most importantly, his people started to believe in him again, not because of what he said but because of what he did. One evening, as Daniel was packing up, Mark stopped by his office. You actually listened, Mark said, leaning against the doorframe. Daniel smirked. Yeah, turns out you had a point. Mark chuckled. Took you long enough. Daniel nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. There were still challenges ahead, still things to fix, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to face them. As he stepped outside, the city lights flickering around him, he realized something. Success had never been about the image. It had never been about proving anything to the world. Real success was quiet. It was built on trust, on integrity, on doing the work when no one was watching. And for the first time in years, Daniel was okay with that.